He could hear people's thoughts, but only right before they died. The silence of the emergency room was a deceptive thing, a fragile skin stretched taut over a chaotic undercurrent of fear and urgency. For Elias Vance, 36 years old and a paramedic who had seen more than his fair share of life's brutal endings, this silence was often the prelude to a different kind of noise, a sudden, intimate intrusion into his mind. It wasn't a constant barrage, just fleeting whispers, the raw, unfiltered thoughts of those teetering on the precipice of oblivion, moments before their lights went out. It was a gift, or perhaps a curse, that had manifested in his late teens, a strange, isolating ability he had learned to live with, a secret he guarded fiercely. It always started subtly, a faint echo in the periphery of his awareness, a single word, a fleeting image. As the life force ebbed, the thoughts would intensify, becoming clearer, more visceral, a final, desperate outpouring of the consciousness about to be extinguished. Sometimes it was regret, a sharp pang of what might have been. Sometimes it was love, a final, heartfelt farewell to a cherished face. Often, it was simply fear, a raw, primal scream against the encroaching darkness. He had learned to recognize the signs, the shallow, ragged breaths, the ashen pallor, the distant look in the eyes that signaled the final descent. And then, the whispers would begin. His first experience had been terrifying, a cacophony of fragmented thoughts flooding his mind as an elderly woman he was attending to after a car accident slipped away. He had heard her calling out for her deceased husband, a desperate plea for him to wait, not to go alone. The raw emotion had been overwhelming, leaving him shaken and confused. Over the years, he had become a reluctant witness to countless final moments. A young boy, his life cut short by a sudden illness, thinking of his mother's smile. A hardened criminal, his last thought a flicker of longing for a childhood he had long abandoned. A lone traveler, his final awareness a sense of peaceful acceptance, a feeling of coming home. He never spoke of it, this strange, unwanted intimacy with death. Who would believe him? He imagined the concerned looks, the hushed consultations. It was his burden to bear alone, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the unspoken depths of the human heart. The ability had made his job both more and less bearable. The clinical detachment required of his profession was often shattered by the raw humanity of those final thoughts. Yet, sometimes, amidst the fear and regret, he would hear a flicker of peace, a sense of completion that offered a strange kind of solace. Tonight was busy. A multi-car pile-up on the highway had flooded the emergency room. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood, the sounds of frantic activity a constant hum. Elias moved with practiced efficiency, his focus narrowed to the tasks at hand, trying to block out the potential for the intrusive whispers. He was attending to a young woman, barely out of her teens, her body broken and still. The paramedics who had brought her in didn't give her much chance. As Elias checked her vitals, the familiar signs began to manifest, the shallow breathing, the ashen pallor. And then, the whispers started. Faint at first, like a distant radio signal. "Mom, Dad, I'm sorry." A wave of guilt, of a life unlived, washed over Elias. He tightened his grip on her wrist, fighting the urge to look away from the raw vulnerability etched on her face. The thoughts intensified. Images flashed in his mind. A graduation gown, a laughing group of friends, a tearful goodbye. A life brimming with potential, about to be extinguished. The weight of it pressed down on Elias, a familiar ache in his chest. He worked with a fierce urgency, his movements precise and desperate, fighting against the inevitable. But the whispers grew stronger, clearer, a final, heart-wrenching outpouring. "I loved him. I never told him." A profound sense of lost love, a regret that would now remain forever unspoken. Then, silence. The monitors flatlined. The young woman was gone. The echoes of her final thoughts lingered in Elias's mind, a heavy reminder of the lives he couldn't save, the unspoken words that vanished into the void. He stepped away, needing a moment to compose himself, the weight of her last moments settling upon him. He found himself in a quieter corner of the emergency room, the frantic activity a muffled backdrop. That's when he heard it, a different kind of whisper, faint but distinct, not from someone fading, but from someone else. It was a single word, laced with a chilling familiarity. "Wait." Elias froze, his senses on high alert. He scanned the room, his gaze sharp, searching for the source. There was no one nearby exhibiting the signs of imminent death. The other patients were stable, their thoughts a jumble of pain and fear, but not the distinct finality he had come to recognize. The whisper came again, closer this time, clearer. You know. A cold dread began to creep up Elias's spine. This wasn't the usual pre-death thought. This was directed at him. He turned slowly, his eyes landing on a man sitting alone on a bench across the room. He looked unremarkable, middle-aged, his face pale, his breathing shallow, but not in the way of someone about to die. There was a strange intensity in his gaze, a knowing look that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. And then, the thought came again, sharp and undeniable. We're the same. Have you ever had a strange or unexplainable experience that made you feel connected to something beyond the ordinary? What was it? The man on the bench continued to look at Elias, his gaze unwavering. The thought echoed in Elias's mind, a chilling resonance. We're the same. What did that mean? He had never encountered anyone else who experienced what he did. He had always believed himself to be utterly alone in this strange, silent world of final thoughts. He approached the man cautiously, his paramedic instincts warring with a growing sense of unease. Are you all right, sir? He asked, his voice neutral, trying to gauge the situation. The man didn't respond verbally, but the thought came again, clear and direct. You hear them too. It wasn't a question, but a statement, a confirmation of Elias's deepest, most guarded secret. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. How could this stranger know? He had never told anyone. His carefully constructed wall of silence began to crumble. Who are you? Elias managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The man offered a faint, almost sad smile. The thought that followed was laced with a weariness that seemed to span lifetimes. Someone who understands the silence after the whispers fade. A cold dread washed over Elias. This wasn't just someone who knew his secret, this was someone who shared it. But how? And why now? Before Elias could formulate another question, a commotion erupted nearby. A code blew. A flurry of activity descended upon a patient in one of the cubicles. Elias's paramedic training kicked in, his focus shifting to the immediate emergency. He moved quickly, his mind momentarily pushing the strange encounter to the back burner. But as he worked on the patient, the familiar whispers began, faint at first, then growing stronger, a desperate plea for air, a final goodbye. And amidst that familiar cacophony, he heard another thought, clear and distinct, cutting through the dying man's fear. It was the same voice from across the room. He's going now. Do you hear it? Elias froze for a fraction of a second, his mind reeling. The man across the room wasn't just hearing his own pre-death thoughts, he was somehow aware of others too. The code blue was unsuccessful. The patient was gone. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hushed voices of the medical staff. Elias looked across the room. The man was still there, his gaze fixed on Elias, a profound understanding in his eyes. He seemed to share the weight of that passing, the echo of those final thoughts. After the immediate crisis had subsided, Elias approached the man again, his initial caution now mixed with a desperate need for answers. How do you know? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, as if rarely used. My name is Silas, and like you, I hear the echoes. If you discovered that someone else shared your deepest, most isolating secret, what would your initial reaction be? Relief, fear, curiosity. Silas explained that he had lived with this ability for even longer than Elias, since he was a child. He described the same strange phenomenon, the fleeting thoughts just before death, the raw emotions laid bare in those final moments. He had also lived in isolation, fearing judgment and disbelief if he ever revealed his secret. He had recognized Elias, he said, not by any outward sign, but by the subtle shift in his demeanor whenever a patient was close to death, a fleeting shadow of awareness that flickered across his eyes. He had seen it in others over the years, a rare, almost imperceptible sign of shared experience, but he had never approached them, too afraid of exposure. But with Elias, there was something different, a resonance he couldn't ignore. He had felt a connection, a sense of shared burden that compelled him to reach out. Silas spoke of the toll the ability took, the constant exposure to the raw emotions of death, the feeling of being a silent witness to so much loss. He had learned to build walls, to try and distance himself, but the echoes always found their way in. For Elias, hearing Silas's words was like stepping out of a long, isolating darkness into a dim but shared light. He was not alone. There was someone else who understood. Over the next few weeks, Silas became an unexpected confidant, a fellow traveler on this strange and solitary path. They shared their experiences, the moments that had haunted them, the strategies they had developed to cope. There was a profound sense of relief in finally being able to speak openly about something he had kept hidden for so long. Silas had learned more about the ability over the years, delving into obscure texts and folklore, searching for any mention of a similar phenomenon. He had found fragmented accounts, whispers of individuals with heightened senses, those who could perceive the veil between worlds thinning. But nothing concrete, nothing that fully explained their shared reality. He theorized that it might be a form of heightened empathy, a neurological quirk that allowed them to tap into the final surge of brain activity before consciousness ceased. Or perhaps something more, something connected to the very fabric of life and death. They didn't have answers, only shared experience. One evening, Silas told Elias about a recurring thought he had heard, a whisper that had stayed with him, a single word spoken with intense longing just before death. The word was, remember. He had heard it countless times, across different ages, different circumstances. Remember, a final plea, a last vestige of the life about to be lost. But remember what? The word resonated deeply with Elias. He too had heard it, a faint echo in the final moments. It was a universal whisper, a final human plea. Then, Silas told Elias something that sent a chill down his spine. Sometimes, just before the remember, he would hear another, even fainter whisper, a single name. A name that was different each time, a name that seemed to hold immense personal significance for the dying individual. But the chilling part was this: sometimes, the name he heard was Elias. The idea of your name being the last thought of a dying stranger, what emotions does that evoke in you? Fear, curiosity, a sense of connection. Silas couldn't explain why he sometimes heard Elias's name in those final moments. It was fleeting, barely audible, often lost in the final rush of thoughts. He had initially dismissed it as his own mind playing tricks, a subconscious projection of his newfound connection with Elias. But it had happened too many times to ignore. For Elias, the revelation was deeply unsettling. Why would dying strangers think of him? He had no connection to them, no prior interaction. It felt like a thread connecting him to the very moments he was witnessing, a deeper involvement in the cycle of life and death than he had ever imagined. They began to explore this strange phenomenon, trying to find a pattern, a connection. They considered the possibility that it was a shared hallucination, a byproduct of their unique ability. But the consistency, the specificity of the names Silas sometimes heard, argued against it. One night, while working in the emergency room, Elias felt the familiar shift, the signs that a patient was fading. The whispers began, a jumble of fear and regret. And then, cutting through the noise, he heard it, clear and distinct, not a pre-death thought from the patient, but a thought directed at him, the same voice he had heard from Silas. "He's thinking of you." Elias's blood ran cold. He glanced across the room. Silas wasn't there. He was off duty tonight. The dying man's final thoughts faded into silence. Elias was left with the chilling certainty that Silas wasn't the only one who could somehow bridge the gap between their minds and the dying. Over the next few weeks, the phenomenon intensified. Elias would occasionally hear those directed thoughts, those confirmations that the dying were somehow aware of him, their final thoughts sometimes including his name, sometimes a feeling of recognition, a sense of familiarity. He and Silas were both disturbed by this new development. It suggested a connection far deeper and more mysterious than they had initially conceived. Were they somehow beacons, drawing the final thoughts of those on the edge? Or was there something else at play, something they couldn't even begin to comprehend? The weight of their strange ability grew heavier, no longer just a silent burden of witnessing death, but an active, inexplicable link to the dying consciousness. The silence after the whispers was now filled with a new, more profound mystery, a chilling question about their role in the final moments of others. Their shared secret had opened a door to an even stranger, more unsettling reality, a connection to death that went far beyond simply hearing the final thoughts. They were somehow part of it. If you discovered you had an inexplicable connection to the final moments of others, a connection that went beyond simply witnessing their thoughts, how would that change your understanding of your own existence?